The door to the funeral home conference room slammed shut behind me with a finality that echoed through my chest. 5 minutes. That's all it took for my sons to sit me down and hand me a brochure for Sunset Ridge Care Facility. The glossy paper showed smiling elderly people playing cards, but all I could see was my reflection in the polished table, a woman who just buried her husband, being told she was next. My youngest, Michael, couldn't even look at me when he said the words that still ring in my ears. "Mom, we think it's time you let someone else take care of you." The funeral flowers were still fresh. Bill's casket hadn't even left the building. 3 months earlier, I was standing in my kitchen making coffee. The same kitchen where I'd raised 2 boys and celebrated 43 anniversaries. The morning light came through the curtains the way it always did, painting everything in soft gold. Bill was sleeping late, which wasn't unusual anymore. The cancer had taken so much from him, but we still had our routine, our life, our home on Maple Street in suburban Chicago. I was wiping down the counter when I felt it, that familiar tremor in my hands that had become my unwelcome companion. The chronic arthritis that had been diagnosed 5 years ago was getting worse, but I managed. I always managed. I didn't know then that my sons were already having conversations about me, that they'd been watching, calculating, planning. When Bill got sick, they started coming around more often, but I thought it was love. I thought they wanted to help their father in his final days. I was so naive. The betrayal wasn't just that they wanted me gone. It was that they'd used my illness, my vulnerability, as ammunition. They'd twisted my shaking hands and occasional memory lapses into evidence that I was incompetent, that I couldn't be trusted with my own life. The thing about love is, it makes you blind to patterns you'd recognize in anyone else's story. If a friend told me her children were suddenly very interested in her finances, I'd have raised an eyebrow. But when it's your own kids, the ones you nursed through fevers and drove to baseball practice, you don't see it. You can't. Because seeing it means admitting something broke in your family that you can't fix. Bill died on a Tuesday morning with both boys at his bedside. I held his hand as he took his last breath, and in that moment, I thought at least we're together in this grief. At least I have my sons. The funeral was beautiful in that terrible way funerals are. People said lovely things about Bill, about his laugh, his dedication to his work as an engineer, his love for his family. I shook hands and accepted casseroles and tried not to collapse under the weight of my new reality as a widow. And then came that conference room, that brochure, that moment when everything I thought I knew shifted under my feet like sand. I remember Michael saying something about quality of care and round-the-clock assistance. But what I heard was, "You're a burden now, Mom. You're expensive and inconvenient, and we need to move on." My oldest, David, had spreadsheets. He actually brought spreadsheets to his father's funeral. They showed the cost of keeping me at home versus the nursing facility. The facility was cheaper, apparently, more efficient. He pointed to highlighted cells with his perfectly manicured finger, explaining monthly costs like I was a business expense to be optimized, not his mother. The numbers blurred together while my heart shattered into pieces smaller than the data points on his charts. I know you're probably screaming at your screen right now, telling me to stand up, to fight back. But here's what you don't understand until you're in it. At 68 years old, freshly widowed, with hands that shake and a body that doesn't always cooperate, you feel powerless. You feel like maybe they're right. Maybe you can't take care of yourself. Maybe you are too old to start over. That night, alone in the house that suddenly felt like a mausoleum, I sat in Bill's recliner and tried to make sense of it. The boys had left with promises to handle everything, to make the arrangements, to take care of me. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt erased, like I was already gone and they were just going through the motions of cleaning up. The metallic taste of shock sat on my tongue for days. I moved through the house like a ghost, picking up Bill's reading glasses, his coffee mug, the mystery novel he'd never finish. Every object felt like evidence of a life that was over, and I couldn't tell where his ended and mine began. The refrigerator hummed in the silence. The clock on the wall ticked. Time was moving forward, but I was stuck in that conference room, staring at smiling strangers in a brochure. I started packing because I didn't know what else to do. The boys said they'd listed the house already, that they had a buyer interested, that everything was moving quickly. "For your benefit, Mom," David had said, "so you don't have to worry about any of this." I folded my clothes and wrapped Bill's photo albums in bubble wrap and felt like I was dismantling my own existence, piece by piece. But something was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It was just a feeling, a nagging sense that this was all moving too fast, too smoothly. They'd already found a facility with an opening? They'd already listed the house? Bill had only been gone a week. How long had they been planning this? The claustrophobia of my own bedroom started to suffocate me. The walls seemed closer every night. I'd wake up in a panic, convinced I couldn't breathe, that I was already in that care facility room with its sterile walls and locked doors. Because that's what they'd told me eventually, when I asked questions. "It's a secured facility, Mom, for your safety. You won't be able to just wander off." The word wander hit me like a slap, like I was a confused child who needed to be contained. I thought that was the worst of it, the assumption that I'd lost my mind along with my mobility. But the receipt I found in David's jacket pocket, the one he'd left draped over my dining room chair, proved it was only the tip of the iceberg. For 43 years, I believed in family above everything else. It was my religion, my purpose, my identity. I was a wife, a mother, a keeper of traditions and maker of memories. Every Thanksgiving dinner, every birthday cake, every bedtime story was an investment in this idea that we were a unit, that we'd take care of each other no matter what. I gave up a teaching career when the boys were born because Bill and I agreed that family came first. I never regretted it. Not once. Even when money was tight and I wondered what might have been, I told myself that this was more important. This was everything. So when my sons sat across from me at Bill's funeral and told me they knew what was best, I wanted to believe them. I needed to believe them. Because if I couldn't trust my own children, what did that say about every choice I'd made? What did that say about the life I'd built? The blind belief wasn't just about trusting them. It was about protecting myself from the truth. If I admitted they might be using me, manipulating me, then I had to admit I'd wasted decades investing in people who saw me as a liability. That's a hard thing to face when you're standing in the wreckage of your life, trying to figure out how to survive. I learned something recently that made my blood run cold. Did you know that only 16% of police officers receive adequate training on elder abuse? 16%. That means if I'd called for help, if I'd tried to report what my sons were doing, there's an 84% chance the officer who showed up wouldn't have recognized it for what it was. They'd have seen concerned children making tough decisions for an aging parent. They wouldn't have seen the manipulation, the isolation, the systematic dismantling of my autonomy. I felt trapped not just by my family, but by a system that doesn't recognize people like me as victims. We're supposed to go quietly into whatever arrangement our children decide is best. We're supposed to be grateful for their concern, their intervention, their control. But here's the thing about being powerless. Sometimes it's a choice. Sometimes it's easier to accept the story they're telling you than to fight for your own narrative. I was choosing powerlessness because the alternative, rebellion and its consequences, felt impossible at my age. Michael called every day to check on my packing progress. He'd ask if I needed help, if I was taking my medications, if I remembered to eat. The concern sounded genuine, and maybe part of it was. Maybe he'd convinced himself this was the right thing, that he was protecting me. But there was something else underneath it, something checking up on me, making sure I was following the script. I started second-guessing everything. Had I locked the door, taken my pills, eaten breakfast? The doubt crept in like fog. making me question my own competence. Maybe they were right. Maybe I couldn't handle this house, this life, this independence. The shaking in my hands seemed worse. My memory felt fuzzier. I was becoming the person they said I was, fulfilling their prophecy through sheer suggestion. One afternoon, I dropped a plate while unloading the dishwasher. It shattered across the kitchen floor, and I stood there staring at the pieces, convinced this was proof. Proof I was declining, proof I needed help, proof my sons were right. I called Michael in tears, and he was there within the hour, cleaning up the mess, patting my shoulder, saying, "Don't worry, Mom, we'll take care of everything." In that moment, his kindness felt like love. It wasn't until later that I realized he'd taken photos of the broken plate, documenting my incompetence for some future purpose I didn't want to imagine. The sacrifice wasn't just my career, though that was part of it. I'd been accepted to graduate school when I got pregnant with David. I'd planned to get my master's in education, maybe teach at the university level someday. I tore up the acceptance letter and threw myself into motherhood instead, telling myself it was a choice, that I was lucky to have options. Bill supported whatever I wanted, but the culture back then didn't really allow for both. Not the way I wanted to do it. So I became the room mother, the PTA president, the woman who always had fresh cookies and a listening ear. I organized fundraisers and coached spelling bee teams and chaperoned field trips. I made Halloween costumes from scratch and hosted sleepovers and taught both boys to drive in my old station wagon. Every moment was a gift I gave them, thinking they'd remember, thinking it mattered. I gave up friendships too. When the boys were young and Bill was working long hours, I didn't have time for book clubs or coffee dates. My college roommate stopped calling after I canceled on her too many times. My sister, who lived 2 states away, became a voice on the phone during holidays. I told myself I'd reconnect later, when the boys were grown, when I had more time. But later never came, and then Bill got sick, and then he was gone, and I realized I'd isolated myself so completely that I had no one to turn to. The house was my monument to that sacrifice. Every room held memories of birthday parties and homework sessions and family game nights. The pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe tracked the boys' heights year by year. The dent in the hallway wall was from the time Michael crashed his bicycle indoors. The rose bushes out front were ones I'd planted the year David graduated high school. This house was the physical manifestation of decades of dedication, and they wanted to sell it before Bill's body was even cold. I thought about the money sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep. Bill and I had been careful, saving what we could, planning for retirement. We'd paid off the mortgage 10 years ago. The house was worth nearly $500,000 now, the realtor had said when David brought her by to do the assessment. $500,000 that would be split between my sons after the facility took its cut of my care. I'd get nothing. Well, not nothing. I'd get a room with a TV bolted to the wall and meals served on plastic trays and the privilege of being alive under someone else's terms. Have you ever totaled up the years you've given to other people? I don't mean it in a bitter way, though I suppose it sounds like that. I mean literally calculated the time. I was married at 25, a mother at 26. That's 43 years of marriage and 42 years of motherhood. If you average 8 hours a day on household and family responsibilities, which is conservative, then that's over 100,000 hours. 100,000 hours of cooking and cleaning and caring and organizing. 100,000 hours they wanted to reduce to a line item in a budget, a problem to be solved with the cheapest possible solution. Research shows that 47% of women report that financial issues caused fights in their relationships, versus 37% of men. I wasn't fighting with Bill about money, but I was fighting with his memory, with the ghost of our plans for growing old together. We'd talked about traveling, about finally taking that trip to Ireland, about spending time with grandchildren that never materialized. Instead, I was packing boxes alone and wondering how I'd become so expendable. The thing about sacrifice is that it's supposed to mean something. It's supposed to create bonds, build loyalty, earn respect. I sacrificed my career, my friendships, my individual identity for my family. and what I got in return was a brochure for Sunset Ridge Care Facility and sons who couldn't wait to liquidate my life. I kept telling myself to be grateful they cared enough to make arrangements. That some elderly people have no one, and at least I had sons who were involved. But gratitude tastes bitter when it's forced. When you're supposed to be thankful for being managed like an inconvenient asset. The receipt changed everything. It was crumpled at the bottom of David's jacket pocket, and I wasn't snooping, I swear. I was just going to hang the jacket up before he came back to get it. But when I picked it up, the paper fell out, and I unfolded it without thinking. It was from a real estate attorney's office, dated 3 weeks before Bill died. 3 weeks. The consultation fee was $250, and the description said estate planning and property transfer. They'd been planning this before my husband was even gone. While I was sitting at Bill's bedside, holding his hand, reading to him from his favorite books, our sons were in some lawyer's office discussing how to carve up our lives. My hands weren't shaking when I read that receipt. They were steady for the first time in days. The tremor that had become my constant companion disappeared, replaced by something cold and clarifying. Rage, maybe, or clarity, or both. I smoothed the receipt flat on the kitchen counter and stared at it until the numbers blurred, until I'd memorized every detail. That's when I stopped crying and started thinking. Really thinking, not the fuzzy, confused thoughts they'd been encouraging, but sharp, analytical thinking that reminded me I used to be good at solving problems. I used to organize entire school fundraisers and coordinate volunteers and manage budgets. My brain still worked. My hands might shake, but my mind was clear. I thought about Bill's brother, Tom, who'd been quiet at the funeral. Too quiet. He'd hugged me and said, "I'm so sorry, Dorothy," and there was something in his eyes that seemed like more than grief. I'd dismissed it at the time, but now I wondered. Tom had always been the honest one, the brother who couldn't lie to save his life. If something was wrong, Tom would know. I called him that night. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear the relief in his voice when I said I needed to talk. We met at a diner on the edge of town, one of those 24-hour places with strong coffee and vinyl booths. Tom looked older than I remembered, or maybe I was just seeing him clearly for the first time since the funeral. He didn't make me ask. He just started talking, the words tumbling out like he'd been holding them in too long. "Dorothy, I'm so sorry. I should have told you sooner. The boys came to me months ago, right after you got the diagnosis. They wanted to know about Bill's insurance, about the house deed, about your finances. They said they were worried about you, that they wanted to make sure you were protected. I believed them at first." The coffee cup in my hand felt like an anchor, something solid to hold on to while my world tilted again. Tom kept talking, telling me how David had asked about power of attorney, how Michael had wondered if there was a way to expedite probate, how they'd both been very interested in the timeline of Bill's illness and what would happen after. Tom had thought it was just preparation, just sons trying to handle difficult logistics. But then they'd started talking about the care facility, about how it made the most sense financially, about how they could manage everything better if I wasn't in the house. Tom's eyes were wet when he said, "I think they've been planning this since they found out you were sick, Dorothy. I think they saw an opportunity. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner." The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A truck driver at the counter laughed at something on his phone. The waitress refilled coffee cups and wiped down tables. Normal life continuing all around me while mine fell apart for the second time in a month. But this time, I wasn't falling. This time, I was landing, hard and angry and ready. I watched a young mother at the next booth cutting her daughter's pancakes into small pieces, feeding her with patience and love, and I wondered when my sons had stopped seeing me as someone worthy of that same tenderness. I spent 3 days gathering evidence. Tom helped, bless him. He went through old emails and found messages between the boys discussing strategy. David had written to Michael, "We need to move fast before she gets her bearings. The grief will work in our favor." Michael had responded, "Already talked to the facility. They have an opening in their memory care unit. We can say it's for her own safety, memory care." They were going to put me in the locked dementia ward even though my mind was fine. Even though the only thing wrong with me was arthritis and the audacity to be old and widowed and in their way. I found more. Bank statements showing they'd already changed the mailing address on Bill's accounts to David's house. Insurance documents with Michael listed as my healthcare proxy. Papers I'd never signed but somehow bore my signature. They'd been forging my name, stealing from me, systematically dismantling my life while I was too grief-stricken to notice. The collapse symbol wasn't dramatic, like in the movies. There was no screaming confrontation or thrown objects. It was quieter than that, more insidious. It was sitting in my lawyer's office, a woman Tom had recommended, watching her face change as she reviewed the documents I'd brought. It was hearing her say, "Mrs. Henderson, I'm sorry to tell you this, but what your sons are doing constitutes elder financial abuse and possibly fraud." Those words, elder abuse, financial fraud, they hung in the air like smoke, choking me. My sons were criminals. My boys, the ones I'd nursed and raised and loved with every fiber of my being, were criminals. And I was their victim. The lawyer's office felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in. I excused myself and found the bathroom, locked the door, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. Who was this woman? Pale, thin, older than I felt inside. When had I gotten so small? When had I started disappearing? But my eyes were clear, angry but clear, and my hands, for all their shaking, held steady when I gripped the edge of the sink. I was still here. Still Dorothy Henderson. Still the woman who'd raised 2 boys and buried a husband and survived 68 years of life's complications. I was still here, and I wasn't going quietly. The lawyer, Margaret, had a plan. We'd freeze the accounts, challenge the power of attorney documents, file for an emergency restraining order, preventing them from selling the house. It would be messy and public and painful. My sons would hate me for it. But they already hated me, didn't they? Or worse, they saw me as nothing at all. Just an obstacle between them and their inheritance. I signed the papers with Margaret watching, witnessed and notarized and legal. Each signature felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I wasn't powerless. I'd never been powerless. I'd just been trusting the wrong people. Walking out of that office, I felt different. Lighter, maybe, or heavier, with purpose. The April sun was warm on my face, and I thought about Bill, about what he'd want me to do. He'd be horrified by his son's behavior, I knew that. He'd want me to fight. He'd want me to survive. I thought that was the worst moment, signing those papers and accepting what my children had become. But the real collapse came that night when I sat alone in the house they were trying to steal and let myself feel it all. The grief wasn't just for Bill anymore. It was for the family I'd thought we were, for the men I'd believed my sons would become, for the life I'd built on foundations that turned out to be sand. I cried until I couldn't anymore, until the tears stopped and all that was left was this hollow ache. But in that hollowness, there was space. Space to rebuild, space to become someone new, space to figure out who Dorothy Henderson was when she wasn't someone's wife or mother, when she was just herself. A betrayal this deep doesn't heal, it scars over. But scars can be stronger than the original skin. They're proof you survived something that should have destroyed you. And I was going to survive this. I was going to do more than survive. My neighbor Gladys knocked on my door the next morning with a casserole and a look of concern. I hadn't been to church in weeks, she said. People were worried. She was worried. I invited her in. And over coffee at my kitchen table, the story came pouring out. Everything. The funeral, the facility, the receipt, the lawyer, all of it. Gladys listened without interrupting, her weathered hands wrapped around her coffee mug. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Dorothy, you're not the first woman in this church who's had to fight her own family, and you won't be the last. But you don't have to fight alone. That's how I learned about the network. A quiet group of women at St. Mary's who'd been through similar situations, who'd survived children or siblings or spouses trying to control them, diminish them, steal from them. They met twice a month in the church basement, ostensibly for Bible study, but really as a support group for women reclaiming their lives. Gladys brought me to the next meeting. There were 8 women there, ranging from their 50s to their 80s. They welcomed me like I was already one of them, because I was. We all were. Survivors of a specific kind of betrayal that the world doesn't talk about enough. The kind that happens behind closed doors in families that look perfect from the outside. I heard stories that made mine seem tame. Women whose children had drained their savings. Women whose husbands had hidden assets for decades. Women who'd been gaslit so thoroughly they'd checked themselves into facilities voluntarily. But I also heard stories of victory. Legal battles won, families cut off, new lives built from scratch. It was possible. It was hard, but it was possible. Helen, a 72-year-old former nurse, became my particular ally. She'd been through something similar with her daughter 5 years ago. She knew the legal system, knew the right questions to ask, knew how to protect yourself when your own family becomes the enemy. She started coming with me to meetings with Margaret. She helped me organize my documents, create spreadsheets, build a case that would be impossible to refute. But more than that, Helen gave me permission to be angry, to stop trying to understand my son's perspective or find excuses for their behavior. They're grown men who chose to treat you like a piggy bank instead of a mother, she said bluntly. You don't owe them understanding. You owe yourself justice. I started sleeping better. The nightmares faded. The house didn't feel like a mausoleum anymore. It felt like a fortress. I was defending it, defending myself, and I had allies. Real allies who saw me as a person worth fighting for. The women helped me in practical ways too. Gladys brought groceries when my arthritis was bad. Helen drove me to doctor's appointments. Margaret, the lawyer, called every few days just to check in. I wasn't alone anymore. I'd found my people, women who understood that surviving betrayal requires a village. Looking back, I think that was when I stopped being afraid, when I realized I had support, I had resources, and I had every right to fight back. My sons had underestimated me. They'd seen an old woman with shaky hands and assumed she'd be easy to manipulate. They were wrong. The plan came together over several weeks. Margaret filed all the necessary paperwork to freeze the accounts and challenge the forged documents. We gathered evidence of the fraud, including testimony from Tom and documentation from the attorney they'd consulted. We built a case that was airtight, undeniable. But I wanted more than just to stop them. I wanted to send a message. I wanted them to know exactly what they'd done and exactly what they'd lost. So while they thought I was passively packing for the facility, I was actually preparing for war. I changed all my passwords, moved my money to new accounts they couldn't access, updated my will to specifically exclude them, and named Helen as my healthcare proxy. Every action was deliberate, calculated. I wasn't confused or incompetent. I was strategic. I also started documenting everything. Every phone call from Michael checking on my progress. Every visit from David to inventory my belongings. I recorded conversations, saved texts, kept a detailed journal. All evidence, all ammunition. And I played along. That was the hardest part. Letting them think they'd won, that I was cooperating, that I was the frail old woman they wanted me to be. I packed boxes slowly, asked questions about the facility, seemed appropriately confused and grateful for their help. Inside, I was counting down to the confrontation, to the moment when I'd reveal that I knew everything. The facility move was scheduled for a Saturday in May. David had rented a truck. Michael had taken the day off work. They'd planned a whole timeline, so efficient, so organized. They'd sell the house the following week. Everything was falling into place for them. Except I wasn't going, and they were about to find out why. Friday night, I didn't sleep. I sat in Bill's recliner, the one the boys had already claimed for David's basement, and thought about the life I'd had versus the life I was about to create. I thought about trust and betrayal, about family, and what that word really means. I thought about my mother, gone 20 years now, and wondered what she'd say about her grandsons trying to rob their own mother. But mostly, I thought about myself. About Dorothy Henderson at 25, bright-eyed and in love, planning a future that seemed so certain. About Dorothy at 40, raising boys and keeping a house and believing in the sanctity of family. About Dorothy at 60, caring for a dying husband and trying to be strong. And about Dorothy at 68, angry and betrayed and refusing to go quietly. I like this version best. This Dorothy had fire. This Dorothy had learned that sometimes the people you love will hurt you, and sometimes the only thing to do is save yourself. This Dorothy was done sacrificing. Saturday morning dawned clear and warm. I made coffee and breakfast, took my time. David and Michael arrived at 9 sharp with the truck. They were surprised to find me sitting at the kitchen table, dressed nicely, papers spread in front of me. Not packing, not ready. Just waiting. "Morning, boys," I said calmly. "We need to talk." The look on their faces. I wish I could describe it adequately. Confusion first, then irritation, then something like fear when they saw Margaret standing in the doorway to the living room, briefcase in hand, professional and intimidating in her power suit. David's jaw tensed in that way it always did when he was cornered as a child, caught in some lie about homework or broken windows. Michael's eyes darted between me and the lawyer, calculating, already searching for an exit strategy. "Mom, what's going on?" David started, but I held up my hand. "No, you don't get to talk right now. You get to listen." I slid the folder across the table, the one containing all the evidence we'd gathered. The forged signatures, the emails, the timeline of their planning, all of it. "You get to read this, and then you get to explain to your attorney, because you're going to need one, how you thought stealing from your widowed mother was acceptable." The silence was deafening. Michael picked up the folder with shaking hands. David's face had gone pale. They flipped through pages, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding to panic. Margaret stepped forward. "Gentlemen, I'm Margaret Foster, Mrs. Henderson's attorney. You're being formally notified of a cease and desist order regarding the sale of this property and access to any of your mother's financial accounts. Additionally, we'll be pursuing criminal charges for fraud and elder abuse. You'll be hearing from the district attorney's office next week. I watched my sons process this, watched them try to formulate responses, excuses, justifications. But what could they say? The evidence was right there in black and white. Their plan, their greed, their betrayal, all documented and undeniable. "Mom, please," Michael finally managed. "We were just trying to help. We thought, with your health, we didn't think you could handle." "Stop," I said quietly. "Just stop. I know exactly what you thought. You thought I was old and broken and easy to control. You thought you could take everything Bill and I built and I'd be too grief-stricken or confused to notice. You were wrong." David found his voice then, and it was angry. "This is ridiculous. You're being manipulated by this lawyer. We're your sons. We were trying to take care of you. By forging my signature? By putting me in a memory care unit when there's nothing wrong with my memory? By planning to sell my home before your father was even buried? That's your version of care?" The truck sat in the driveway, empty and useless. The boxes I'd packed, the ones they thought were for the facility, were actually donations for the church. I'd been preparing all right, just not for the life they'd planned for me. "You need to leave," I said, standing up. My hands were steady. My voice was clear. "This is my home, and you're not welcome in it anymore. If you attempt to contact me or approach this property, I'll file for a restraining order. Margaret has all the documentation necessary to make that happen quickly." They left. What else could they do? David tried to argue, but Margaret reminded him that anything he said could be used in court. Michael actually cried, but I felt nothing watching his tears. They were for himself, for getting caught, not for what he'd done to me. I watched from the window as they loaded into the truck and drove away. Tom had been sitting in his car across the street, waiting in case I needed backup. He came to the door after they left, and I fell into his arms, finally letting myself feel the weight of what I'd just done. "I cut off my sons," he said gently. "Is that really what you wanted?" "I wanted them to be different people," I said, "but they're not. And I can't sacrifice myself anymore for people who see me as a transaction." The weeks that followed were hard in different ways. The legal process moved forward. David and Michael hired a lawyer who tried to paint me as mentally incompetent, but the medical records didn't support that. My arthritis was well managed. I had no cognitive issues. Their case fell apart quickly. But there was no real punishment for them beyond legal fees and the public embarrassment of having their attempted fraud exposed. The district attorney explained that elder abuse cases are hard to prosecute, that juries often sympathize with adult children who claim they were trying to help. We could push forward with criminal charges, but the outcome was uncertain. In the end, I dropped the criminal case, not because I forgave them, but because I was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of thinking about them, tired of letting them occupy space in my life. The civil case was enough. The restraining order was enough. The complete severance of our relationship was enough. I kept the house, I kept my money, I kept my independence. They got nothing, which was exactly what they deserved. But here's the thing. Nobody tells you about winning. It doesn't feel triumphant. It feels empty. I'd won the battle, but I'd lost my family. My sons were strangers now, people I'd given birth to and raised and loved who'd become my enemies. That's a grief that doesn't have a name, a loss that no one prepares you for. The churchwomen understood. They'd all been through versions of this, the hollow victory of surviving family betrayal. "We do what we have to do," Helen said, "and then we build new families from people who actually deserve us." So that's what I did. The women from St. Mary's became my family. Tom and his wife became my family. The neighbors who'd rallied around me became my family. It wasn't the family I'd planned for, but it was real and supportive and honest. I started teaching again, not at a university like I'd once dreamed, but at the community center where the churchwomen met. I taught a class on financial literacy for seniors, on recognizing manipulation, on protecting yourself from the people who are supposed to protect you. The class was always full. Apparently, my story wasn't unique. Teaching gave me purpose again. Every woman who left my class with knowledge she didn't have before, every person who recognized red flags in their own life because of something I'd shared, it all meant something. It transformed my pain into something useful, something that could protect others. I also started volunteering with a legal aid organization that helps elderly people navigate abuse situations. Margaret introduced me to the group, and they were grateful to have someone who'd been through it, who could talk to clients from a place of understanding. I became a peer counselor, walking other women through the same process I'd survived. Months passed. The house that had felt like a monument to sacrifice became just a house where I lived. I repainted Bill's office and turned it into a craft room. I replaced the furniture the boys had claimed with pieces I actually liked. I made the space mine again. My hands still shake sometimes. The arthritis isn't going anywhere, but I manage. I take my medication. I do my exercises. I ask for help when I need it from people who actually care about me. I'm not powerless. I never was. The story doesn't have a Hollywood ending. My sons didn't apologize or see the error of their ways. They hired a mediator at one point, tried to negotiate some kind of reconciliation, but their terms included access to my finances and decision-making power over my health care. They still saw me as incompetent, still believed they'd been right to try to control me. I declined the mediation. I hear about them sometimes through Tom. David got divorced. Apparently, his wife didn't appreciate learning he'd tried to defraud his own mother. Michael moved out of state. They're living their lives, and I'm living mine. And there's an ocean of hurt between us that I don't think can ever be crossed. But do you think that was fair? That they faced no real consequences beyond losing access to me? That they got to walk away from their attempted theft and fraud with nothing more than legal fees and embarrassment? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place? Because some days, I wonder if I should have pushed harder for criminal charges, if I should have made them pay more than they did. Other days, I think the real justice is that I'm here, in my home, living my life on my terms. They wanted me erased, controlled, contained. Instead, I'm teaching and volunteering and helping other women avoid the trap I fell into. They wanted my money and my house. Instead, I'm using both to build a life that matters, that helps people, that means something. I don't know if that's enough. I don't know if justice is ever really enough when the people who hurt you were supposed to love you. But it's what I have, and I'm choosing to make it count. A year after that Saturday morning confrontation, I was sitting in my living room with the church women, celebrating Helen's birthday, when someone asked how I was really doing. Not the polite surface answer, but the real truth underneath. I'm rebuilding, I said. Not the life I had, because that's gone, but something new, something mine. And that felt like the truest thing I'd said in a long time. I was rebuilding, not quickly, not perfectly, but deliberately. Every day I chose to get up, to teach my class, to help another woman recognize the warning signs, to live fully despite the betrayal, was an act of reconstruction. The life I have now is smaller in some ways. I don't have grandchildren visiting or sons calling on weekends. I don't have the big family gatherings I once hosted. But it's fuller in others. It's authentic. Everyone in my life now is here because they choose to be, because they value me, because they see me as a whole person deserving of respect. I've learned to value that more than blood ties or family obligation. I've learned that the people who stick around through the hard parts, who help you gather evidence and file legal papers and rebuild your life from scratch, those are your real family. DNA doesn't guarantee loyalty or love. Showing up does. Before I end my story, I want to share something important I learned through all of this. Something that might save you or someone you love from a similar situation. Because what happened to me isn't rare. It's happening right now to thousands of elderly people across this country. And most of them don't have the resources or support I was lucky enough to find. Elder abuse is one of the most underreported crimes in America. Studies show that only 1 in 24 cases is ever reported to authorities. That means for every person like me who fights back, there are 23 others suffering in silence. And financial abuse by family members is the most common form, affecting an estimated 5 million seniors every year. The warning signs are subtle, which is why they're so dangerous. It starts with someone showing excessive interest in your finances. Your adult child suddenly wants to be added to your bank accounts for convenience. They suggest you sign a power of attorney just in case. They start making comments about how hard it must be for you to manage everything alone, how they could help if you just let them take over. Then comes the isolation. They discourage you from seeing friends or other family members. They might say, those people are trying to take advantage of you, or that you're not up for visitors, or that they're protecting you. Really, they're cutting off your support system, so there's no one to notice what's happening. The manipulation intensifies. They start questioning your memory, your competence, your judgment. Did you forget to pay that bill? Are you sure you took your medication? Maybe you shouldn't be driving anymore. They're not helping. They're undermining. They're creating a narrative of incompetence that justifies their control. By the time you realize what's happening, they've often already done significant damage. Money is missing. Documents are signed. Your name is on loans you don't remember taking out. And when you confront them, they act hurt that you'd suspect them of anything wrong. They were just trying to help. How could you think they'd take advantage? Here's what I wish someone had told me. You have rights. Even if you're old, even if you're sick, even if your hands shake or your memory occasionally fails, you have the right to control your own life. You have the right to make your own decisions, manage your own money, choose where you live. And anyone who tries to take those rights away through manipulation or fraud is committing a crime. If you're in a situation like I was, here's what you need to do. First, document everything. Save emails, text messages, bank statements, any communication that shows a pattern of control or manipulation. Keep a journal of concerning interactions. This evidence will be crucial if you need legal help. Second, talk to someone outside the family. A trusted friend, a clergy member, a social worker. Elder abuse thrives in secrecy. Breaking that silence is the first step toward getting help. Third, secure your finances. If you haven't already, make sure your bank accounts and important documents are in your name only. Be very careful about granting power of attorney. It's one of the most commonly abused legal tools. If you do need to assign someone, choose someone with no financial interest in your estate. Fourth, know your resources. Every state has an Adult Protective Services Agency that investigates elder abuse. There are legal aid organizations that provide free help to seniors. The National Center on Elder Abuse has a hotline and resources. You're not alone, even when it feels like you are. And finally, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Your gut is telling you that you're being manipulated or controlled for a reason. Don't let anyone convince you that you're paranoid or confused. You know your own life better than anyone else. I also learned that recovery is possible, but it takes time and support. The trauma of family betrayal is real and deep. I worked with a therapist who specialized in elder abuse to process what had happened, to rebuild my sense of self-worth, to learn to trust again. That investment in my mental health was as important as the legal battle. I learned to set boundaries, something I'd never been good at before. I learned to say no. I learned that prioritizing myself isn't selfish, it's survival. I learned that I deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, and anyone who can't offer that doesn't deserve access to my life. Most importantly, I learned that my value isn't tied to my usefulness to others. For decades, I'd measured my worth by how well I served my family. When they decided I wasn't useful anymore, I believed them. But my worth is inherent. I matter because I'm a human being with thoughts and feelings and rights, not because of what I can provide to someone else. That might seem obvious, but it's revolutionary when you've spent your whole life being someone's wife or mother or caretaker. Learning to just be Dorothy, to value myself for myself, was the hardest and most important work I did in my recovery. The women in my class often ask if I regret how things turned out, if I wish I could have my family back. The answer is complicated. I regret that my sons chose greed over love. I regret that I had to fight my own children. I regret the years I wasted believing in a version of family that didn't actually exist. But I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret saving myself. I don't regret building this new life that's honest and authentic and mine. Sometimes the only way forward is to let go of what's behind you, even when it's family, even when it hurts, even when it's not fair. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. I know it wasn't easy to hear. These kinds of betrayals are uncomfortable to acknowledge because they force us to question assumptions about family and trust and safety. But that discomfort is necessary. These stories need to be told so others can recognize the warning signs before it's too late. I'm curious, where are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Are you sitting in a quiet house, maybe worrying about your own situation? Are you thinking about an elderly parent or neighbor who might need help? Drop a comment and let me know. This community we're building here matters. And if my story resonated with you, if you saw yourself or someone you love in my experience, please hit that like button. It helps other people who need to hear this find it. Your engagement literally saves lives by spreading awareness of elder abuse. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place? Would you have pushed for criminal charges? Would you have tried to reconcile? I'm genuinely interested in your perspectives because these situations are never simple, and there's no one right answer. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel because I share stories like mine every week. Real people, real struggles, real survival. And in the description, I've linked 2 related videos you might find helpful. One is about recognizing financial manipulation in relationships, and the other is about rebuilding your life after family betrayal. Both have insights that could protect you or someone you love. Until the next story, take care of your heart, protect your peace. And remember that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, it's determined by how you treat yourself. You deserve dignity, respect, and autonomy, no matter your age or circumstances. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise.